Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, having taken all the results from the coalition officers from the 36 states and the FCT, we will now proceed to do the computation and tallying on the manual entries that we have, and then also cross-check them with the Excel sheet just to ensure that there are no mistakes. We will do that before we come back to you for final announcements. Thank you very much.
Do you think only this will talk? Cannot see.
Well, we have finally reached the point that everyone has been waiting for. The coalition officer for Borno State with respect to the presidential election had just concluded presenting the figures and results of the presidential election in Borno State. Professor Yagana Ngirta announced that APC scored 473,543 votes, while PDP recorded 25,640 votes. Immediately thereafter, Professor Attahir Jega, the INEC chairman, and in this case, the presidential returning officer for the 2015 presidential election, declared that the INEC Collation Center will proceed to begin the computation of all the figures and the results from all the 36 states of the Federation, including the Federal Capital Territory. Once again, Mr. Nick Dazang, Deputy Director, Public Affairs of INEC, is here with me to take us through what this computation will entail.
Thank you very much. Before the Honorable Chairman would finally declare the winner of this election, he has to go through all the figures submitted to him by the returning officers from the states. He would now confirm the veracity of these figures, then effect the computation with the support of our staff, and he will now confirm again, and then he will now check also the scores of each of the candidates in terms of the requirements of the Constitution with regard to the spread. You know, I said earlier on here that in a contest of this nature, a winner can only emerge if he has secured the highest votes cast in the election, and if he has also secured at least 25% of the votes cast in at least 2/3 of the states of the Federation and the Federal Capital Territory. Now that will come to 24 states plus the FCT. So the INEC chairman now will now ensure that whoever is declared by him as the winner of this election has satisfied these constitutional requirements.
But a lot of members of the public I know will now be saying, what is all this process? Why is it necessary? More so when, from all reports, the President Goodluck Jonathan had already conceded defeat to General Muhammadu Buhari.
This is a requirement by law and by the Constitution. If this particular protocol is not undergone or is not effected by the Honorable Chairman, the election can be construed to have taken place. So it is very important that this ceremony, this formality, this seal of approval by the Honorable Chairman is put on this election.
You know, I earlier asked you whether this computation process will be done in public, and you did say yes. But here we are. The Collation Center is not, we are not seeing what's going on.
Yes, even before now, our staff would have done this computation. We have very competent staff in our ICT and operations department whose task is to assist the chairman to do these computations. But at the same time, he has to also go through minutely and in greater detail the computations to ascertain that the right thing has been done before he finally gives his seal of approval. You know, any mistake at this juncture can mar the entire process. So it is very important that no mistake is made, and at the end of the day, nobody can contest what has happened in a court of law, or even if someone does, at the end of the day, the courts will uphold what the commission has done because it has followed due process.
I know that you have been involved in so many of this kind of elections. I mean, you took a major part in the 2011 elections. You saw how the declarations were made. You are part and parcel of it. Now, let me ask you this question. At what point is INEC chairman and the chief returning officer for the 2015 presidential election going to present the certificate of return to the winner?
Well, by law, this takes place 7 days after the declaration. So if it is possible, even by tomorrow, after this declaration, the INEC chairman can proceed to issue the certificate of return to the winner of this election.
And traditionally, the winner has to come to the INEC headquarters.
Yes, he has to come to the...
It's not the INEC chairman going
because,
to the winner.
you know, the declaration took place here. But for other elections where the declaration and return took place in Abuja, so the winner has to come and collect the certificate from the chief electoral officer. But in other elections where the returns are made in the states, the winner can afford to collect the certificate, through either the national commissioner or the resident electoral commissioner. But we've had occasions in the past where governors insist that they prefer to come and collect their certificates at the INEC headquarters because they feel it is more prestigious.
Well, you have made reference to elections that are declared at the state level, or rather at the purview of the resident electoral commissioners, who in that case are the returning officers. We're talking of, for example, now the National Assembly elections. The social media is awash with the results. But at what point do we now say there is a seal of approval to all the figures we have heard in the media?
Yes, as these elections were the collation here was taking place, you know, they were also taking place at the senatorial and House of Representatives level. And the returning officers are other than the returning officers for this particular election. So, you know, if you've had time to follow, you would have discovered that as the elections took place and they were concluded at that level, they were returned by the relevant returning officers. But that process has been overshadowed or overwhelmed because of the stature of the presidential election. But in the next set of elections, where we would have the governorship and the House of Assembly elections, what will play out is that the returning officers at that level will perform their roles at the level of the state. You know, so what we will do here at the end of the day is to monitor what is happening in the states and ensure that the election goes well.
What I meant here by asking you the issue of, with respect to the National Assembly election is to know who authenticates whatever figures or results that has been announced so far with respect to the elections of senators and members of the House of Representatives.
Well, there are returning officers appointed for these elections, but it is not as if they will act in isolation of the commission. Whatever they do must also have the oversight and the approval of the commission. But it is the remit of the Honorable Chairman and the Chief Electoral Commissioner to, you know, declare this result of the presidential election, and that is why we are here, and our attention is dedicated to this particular election. And as you know, this particular election has elicited more interest than all the other elections put together.
So in a nutshell, all the senators who are so far declared by the resident electoral commissioners stand declared?
Yes, they stand declared because you see, according to the law and constitution, the commission can authorize any other person it deems fit to return elections on its behalf. And that is why in this particular election, the INEC chairman authorized vice chancellors, former vice chancellors, and some deputy vice chancellors to serve as his returning officers in the states. But the final declaration by law can only be made by him
as the chief
returning officer.
Well, while we wait for the final computation of the figures and the results from across the 36 states and the FCT, or rather, how long do you think we can wait, or we will be waiting?
Well, it won't take long because, like I said, the Honorable Chairman has set in motion this particular task before now. Now, all he wants to do now is to reconfirm that all the calculations, the calibrations are correct before he will now finally declare the winner of this election.
Mr. Nix, it's been interesting having you, but I know that you are not going. You are still with us here in the NTA Nigeria Side Studio at the International Conference Center, which happens to be the venue of the INEC National Collation process for the 2015 presidential election, as we await the conclusion, the final computation of figures and results from across the 36 states of the Federation, and the Federal Capital Territory by the Chief Returning Officer of the 2015 presidential election in person of the INEC Chairman, Professor Attahiru Jega. We will at this point take you back to our NTA network studios for the scheduled programs of the day, but with a promise that we will come back to you live from this studio and the INEC reconvene. I'm Muhammad Kudu Abubakar.